you so much, and thank you for sticking around for this. My talk today is drawn from my book, which began about 5 years ago when I was at a conference in Boston. A scholar of Japanese popular culture made an offhand remark about an emerging practice among teens in the country. He said that they're sending blank text messages to each other. So the idea was that if you were in a romantic relationship, you would send your romantic partner a text, no words. It just pops up on their phone as a little blip. And their job as your partner was to send you back a blank text message with as little time elapsed as possible. So the idea is that you're paying attention enough to notice that your partner has texted you and you text them back immediately. And there are no words, there's no images, there's no videos sent. The content here is time. So this fascinated me. I've been studying mobile media culture for a while and thinking about how people exchange messages with one another, and there's no content here. The content is time. But the problem with the text messages was that nobody had ever heard of it. I started asking around other experts or people who had lived in Japan, and nobody had ever heard of the blank text messages. So I went to Tokyo and to try to hunt down this story, and I interviewed dozens of college students to find out about their practices. Had they sent blank text messages before? And when I brought up the story of the blank texts, I was greeted with nothing but blank stares. They had never sent a blank text message in their whole life. I talked to scholars of mobile culture in Japan. None of them had heard of it. So for me, this story of the Japanese blank text messages was really interesting because I began to think about how this has been something we've done throughout history. We've sent messages and we've waited for responses, and the wait times have been meaningful. They've been content in and of themselves. And so now this founding story of my book was apocryphal. It didn't ever happen. I came back to the United States after my trip to Tokyo, and I was telling my colleague at the University of Maryland about this, and he said, well, actually, when I was a teenager in Italy, we did something really similar called ringing. So this was in the days before social media, before Facebook, and it was also in an era when sending a text message cost you per text. There was no unlimited data plans, so what people would do to circumvent that was to ring each other. So what you would do is you would ring your friend or your romantic partner, and your caller ID would show up on their phone, and then you hang up after one ring. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's a way of communicating, I'm thinking about you. And your job as their friend or romantic partner was to ring them back with as little time elapsed as possible. So my friend was telling me about this, my colleague at the University of Maryland was telling me about this, and he would get so many rings in a day from his friends, and he had a romantic partner. Many of them went to different high schools, so they wouldn't see each other throughout the week. So between classes, they would just send a ring to each other. And he said, I was so burdened down by all of these rings I had to return to people. And he had this romantic partner, and he'd get rings all the time. And in these moments between sending and receiving a ring, he was reflecting on their relationship, and he's said, I'm just not that into you to really keep returning these rings all day long to you. So he ended their relationship. So for me, these rings became a moment of reflection. The wait times are really interesting moments of reflection for us to understand our social lives. And both the blank messages in Japan and the Italian rings belong in this long lineage of technologies that have kept us in touch. In each culture and in every era, we've sent messages and we've waited for a response. We do it now with our emails and our text messages, and people throughout history have waited for messages from runners or people riding on horseback delivering messages, letters sealed and stamped, telegraph transmitting across oceans, news reports in the daily edition. And the delay between sending and receiving messages is something we've always interpreted. And we've interpreted through anxiety, through hope, fear, boredom, longing. And these interpretive moments are really powerful tools that shape our social lives. And technologies for keeping in touch have actually changed the rhythms of daily life. Sending and receiving a message shifts the ways that we are able to bridge distances with one another, and also create a pace for our social relationships. When we're not near each other, when we're keeping in touch through messages, anticipating those messages, and the speed at which those messages can be delivered actually shapes the human experience of time. So I've gone back through history to understand how technologies for keeping in touch have transformed what it means to experience time and duration, with a particular focus on waiting. So time itself is an essential component to our media for keeping in touch with one another. And so the book that I've been working on, which is called Delayed Response, a new title. Delayed Response, The Art of Waiting from the Ancient to the Instant World, which will be out this fall in November from Yale University Press and funded through the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, does a bit of an archaeological dig back through media history to understand how these media have shaped our senses of time and how that time ultimately shapes who we are. And one example is in the second chapter is the pneumatic tube system here in New York City. Second chapter looks at how pneumatic tubes, which began in 1897 here in New York all the way through the 1950s, created this notion of instant messaging. You could send messages to each other all day long through the mail system. It'd be delivered in an hour and ran throughout the day and kept people in touch. And all of a sudden, people had this notion of I can send messages, I can coordinate, I can communicate all day long with the people in my life. E.B. White wrote about this in his book, Here is New York. And he wrote that it's a miracle that New York works at all. The subterranean system of telephone cables, power lines, steam pipes, gas mains, and sewer pipes is reason enough to abandon the island to the gods and weevils. Every time an incision is made in the pavement, noisy surgeons expose ganglia that are tangled beyond belief. When a young man in Manhattan writes a letter to his girl in Brooklyn, the love message gets blown to her through a pneumatic tube, just like that. So for White, he brings up a really fantastic point that kind of echoes throughout the book, that it's not just that a love message is being delivered, it's how it's being delivered and the speed at which it's being delivered. It's a letter through pneumatic mail, and the speed at which it's delivered is an essential part of the message itself. And I work from the mobile era, thinking about how our own lives and our instant messages link with this period of the pneumatic mail in New York City. I think about the fiber optic age, but it's also that these wait times are not just shaping our social lives, it shapes what we know. Wait times are an essential part of knowledge production. I spent time with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab team that was running the New Horizons mission to Pluto. And I'm a digital media scholar, and I study the instant. I'm studying how college students are communicating instantly to each other throughout the day, and talking with these astrophysicists about their projects. The New Horizons missions was decades in the making. Took 9 years to arrive to Pluto. When it arrived and finished its flyby of Pluto, as the spacecraft has continued onto the Kuiper Belt, it turned around and beamed its data back to the Earth. It took 16 months for that data to downlink to Earth. So it took like 40 years for these people to get their data, and they're still combing through it. Knowledge takes time for us to process. So I've been really interested in people who do longitudinal studies, as well as people like the New Horizons team, to think about how knowledge requires time, and very much in contrast to our own sort of curiosities that we can just look up on Wikipedia, and the ability for us to have instant knowledge. Instead, we see that waiting can become an essential feature for how knowledge is produced and maintained and then innovated on as well. I've connected this back to Civil War letters and the pace at which letters shaped soldiers' lives and their families' lives, and the infrastructures through which these letters were delivered. I've gone back and spent time in the British National Archives looking at medieval seals. How does your body connect across distances? People needed to find a way to authenticate their identities across vast distances, and seals were one way of doing that. Imprinting your own mark onto the document itself as a way of verifying who you were and also communicating your power. Don't delay in responding to me. I am a person of authority. All the way back to the very first messages humans ever sent, which were Aboriginal message sticks 40 to 55,000 years ago. As people began migrating onto the continent of Australia, they used a very sophisticated means of communicating with one another to share knowledge about the landscape as they would begin moving across it. So all of this fits in with sort of the study of nonverbal communication, which we typically think of in terms of gesture. We think of facial expressions, proximity even is a part of nonverbal communication, but time is also a part of that, which Edward T. Hall talks about in his book, The Silent Language. He opens it by saying, "Time talks. It speaks more plainly than words. The message it conveys comes through loud and clear. Because it is manipulated less consciously, it is subject to less distortion than the spoken language. It can shout truth where words lie." So we might think of this as like the pregnant pause is a really good example. You know, if you ask somebody, "How do I look today?" Good. You know, that pause is meaningful. It becomes something that you interpret. Comedian and author Jessie Klein talks about this moment where she was getting married. She decided she was going to get a wedding dress, even though she hated the idea. It went against every grain of feminism in her. She didn't want to be this cookie cutter wedding dress, you know. So she tries on a dress, which she said looked a little bit like a slutty saloon owner, which she loved. She took a picture of it. She's like, "This is fantastic." She texts it to her best friend and says, "Is this the one?" And then it's over iMessage, so she sees the little 3 dots come up that means somebody's typing on the other end. She's waiting, and then the 3 dots disappear. And then they pop up again, the person's typing, and then they disappear. And then they come up again. She's like, I'm done with this. I'll send it to all my friends. So she sends it to a bunch of her closest friends. "Is this address?" And she said, "I'm just getting 3 dotted all over the place. All of these people are hesitating. You can just see on the interface that they are typing, and then they're like, oh, how do I put it? This is not the dress for you." Eventually, one of her friends texts back and says, that's okay. I'm happy to keep shopping with you more. She does end up wearing the dress. She buys it. But through the interface, you could see the hesitation, how ultimately the wait time for a response communicated loud and clear to her that her friends absolutely hated that. So for the book, I look at waiting as not an in-between time. We think of it as this gap between moments, but actually waiting has been this silent force that's been shaping our social interactions and also the ways that we produce knowledge. And it's actually designed into the very fabric of our mobile technologies. I did a nationwide study both in the US and in Canada with university students about their mobile use. And by and large, they expect a response to their text messages within 5 minutes. And this actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because ultimately, for how we use our mobile devices, just think about how you use your device within a day. If you're 34 years or younger, you are opening and unlocking your phone on an average 150 times in a day. And all of us in this room who have a smart device, we are clicking, tapping, and swiping an average of 2,600 times in a day. So when you send somebody a message and they've got this device on them throughout the day, you expect that they're going to look at it at some point. And likely within 5 minutes. The students that we surveyed begin to get worried and concerned. Why hasn't this person responded to me within the hour? So here there are real social expectations about delay, and they communicate very clearly. And we use our mobile devices since 2009 on a global scale more for texting and data exchange with each other than we do for voice communication. So we're actually using our devices in a way that centers waiting. You send a message and you wait for a response. That's how we prefer to use our devices. And it fits in with the social lives of these devices as well, where we don't want to call somebody and interrupt a particular thing. So we decide to center waiting instead, which is very odd because we hate waiting. We despise waiting. Waiting becomes a thing that creates anxiety about how long we'll be left waiting, especially when there is no feedback or little feedback given about when your waiting will end. Someone who makes another person wait by either being late or forcing them to cool their heels somewhere, it can be seen either as a sign of disrespect or to reiterate a particular power dynamic in that relationship. So waiting can make us feel powerless. It can make us feel frustrated. And it's true not only of these large moments of waiting where you have to go to Department of Motor Vehicles, or even a larger scale, waiting for you to finally finish your dissertation, that kind of long-term thing. It's also found its way into the smaller, mundane moments of life where you're waiting in line, where you feel obligated to pull out your phone and occupy your time in some way. So tech companies are seizing on these avoidance techniques for waiting, where we do have this disdain for waiting, and to find a way for them to utilize that. So waiting in one sense can be a way for us to be drawn to a tech company's product, an app or something along those lines. In a moment of waiting, you want to use your time productively, effectively, so you are often drawn to a particular technology, maybe email or a game, to occupy your time. Waiting can conversely be the thing that pushes you away from the tech company's product. Amazon did an interesting study where they found that on average, if their customers are forced to wait a tenth of a second, they would lose 1% of their revenue. So to put this in perspective, a tenth of a second is about the time that it takes for a sensation to go from your nerve ending to your brain. That's how quick it is. So it's beyond the perceptible even, that short register of time. But it's effective. It's enough to drive people away, to feel that something is wrong. Google was similarly doing a study where they were responding to customer requests for more search results on a page. Right now, if you do a Google search, 10 results come up. And they were experimenting, well, what if we give people 30 search results instead? The results produced a latency of about a half second, which meant for 30 search results, it took about a half second longer for you to get that. And in the group that they were studying this with, there was a 20% drop in traffic because of this half second delay. So waiting here reveals a contradiction. It is both an opportunity and the thing that needs to be eliminated. So waiting is a moment of awareness. We realize we're waiting and we feel obligated to use that time in some kind of way that either helps ease the anxiety of it or to help us feel productive. And then at the same time, it's something that needs to be eliminated. It's a bug in the system. So the mythologies of the digital age are centered around the idea that waiting is the antithesis of technological innovation. In our ever-accelerating culture, waiting runs counter to that. And we're promised sort of the ever-accelerating paces of connectivity as we're trying to connect with people who are not near us, who are not in this room with us. Eventually that distance might be bridged by technological innovation. So ultimately our time is calibrated to notions of efficiency that in a single gesture both demonize waiting while preying on it as the opportune moment to occupy our attention. So waiting for me is this really interesting moment to study, and the book advocates for us to become students of waiting, and to understand it, and to understand how it teaches us about power dynamics, who is forced to wait or who is immune from waiting, cultural notions about productivity and efficiency. Why do we hate waiting so much? How do we perceive our own time? How knowledge is produced and requires time, and then ultimately how these times shape our social lives. And part of this is, the book concludes with this idea of tactics of waiting, and I'm drawing on Desserteau's contrasting notions of tactics and strategies. These are military terms. So strategy is when a military force comes in and makes an attack. And in response to that attack, the other side creates a tactic, it's a way of dealing with the strategy that has been imposed. So there are tactics to waiting that we can employ that help us become students of waiting. And I think the first part of it is, as you're waiting, we need to ultimately get past the emotions of waiting. We often feel the anxiety or the boredom or the longing that is associated with waiting, and instead shifting them toward a simple question of, why am I waiting? This is where I begin. Why am I waiting? And this produces shallow answers that I think are a really good first step in developing tactics for waiting. You might be waiting because your friend is running late. You might be waiting because a colleague is finishing up a previous meeting. You might be waiting because the train runs only every 20 minutes on the weekend, or you decided to go to a restaurant at peak hours and the kitchen is slammed. The follow-up question that helps with this is that I find really fascinating is to, in that moment, ask yourself, who benefits from me waiting? And it might be you. In one sense, we sometimes benefit from our own waiting. If you think about waiting as a virtue, patience, if we think about the ideas of delayed gratification, I'm going to wait and not eat that one marshmallow for you to come back in the room so I can have the second marshmallow, that I benefit from waiting. Delayed gratification is all around that. Going to grad school is delayed gratification. You benefit from this time where you're anticipating a career. But waiting can also reveal the structural benefits for those in positions of power who are able to reiterate that power by making us wait. There's been really interesting studies of waiting rooms. One was done in South America, looking at welfare offices and how they are designed. They are typically designed with too few seats to accommodate the number of people that are in there. There's also no feedback in the space for when your waiting will end. There's no numbers called. You don't even know if you're actually going to get your government subsidy that day. So there's very little sense about, as you enter that space, if you're going to get what you came for. And all of this reiterates this power differential between the people who are waiting and the people who are in charge in that space. And we can see this play out over and over again. As you know, a person might make you wait to simply reiterate their power in that relationship. This is true of romantic relationships as well. As people make other people wait, it is vying for a certain level of power in that relationship. Roland Barthes has a great book, A Lover's Discourse, where he talks about waiting quite a bit. In that he writes, "Am I in love? Yes, since I am waiting. The other never waits. Sometimes I want to play the part of the one who doesn't wait. I try to busy myself elsewhere to arrive late, but I always lose at this game. Whatever I do, I find myself there with nothing to do, punctual, even ahead of time. The lover's fatal identity is precisely I am the one who waits." So in our most intimate relationships, how we wait reveals some of the power dynamics that are at play in those relationships. And it's worth asking how we make other people wait as well. How do you make people wait in your life as a way of exercising power within that relationship? Out of this, two themes ultimately emerge. Waiting is a way that power is exercised in one way, and then also one thing that I've been drawn to is a shift in thinking that looks at waiting as a collective time rather than an individual time. One of the reasons that waiting is such a burden for us is that we feel that our time is unique from one another. And when you make me wait, you're stealing my time. We all are incredibly busy. We feel very tasked and overburdened with our schedules. And when somebody makes you wait, they're stealing one of the most rare resources you have, your time. And I saw this play out when I was at a grocery store in my hometown. And it was Sunday morning. The grocery store was packed. I was third in line. There were 3 people behind me. The woman who was checking out was paying half with half with food stamps, half with cash. She had her toddler in the cart, and she had a bunch of coupons that she was working with the checker to make sure every single coupon was counted. There was an affluent white woman in front of me who turns around and rolls her eyes, just like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening to us. And the manager had to come over because one of the things that was on sale wasn't being counted. And then some of the guys behind me were verbalizing their discontent. Oh my God. And the woman just ignored them and just kept going. And the reason that there was so much frustration in that line was people perceived that this woman was making them wait longer than was socially acceptable on a Sunday morning when the supermarket is totally slammed. So if my time is distinct from your time and you're wasting my time, you're stealing my resource. But if we shift perspectives a bit, we can see our time is intertwined with one another. Then we can imagine waiting as an investment in somebody else's social circumstance. Communication scholar Sarah Sharma talks about this. She has a great book called In the Meantime, where she looks at the relationship between time and labor. And she argues that the contradictions of the digital age center around this moral imperative of using our time wisely, while ultimately critiquing those who have to use their time differently than us because of a structural impediment on them, such as the woman who has to pay half with food stamps, half with cash. So our moral imperative to use our time wisely ultimately comes out of this very Western notion of using individual time in productive ways. And Sharma argues in her book for a shift of thinking, that if we are temporally aware that the fact that time is not distributed evenly to all of us, then a new moral imperative emerges, that my time is bound with yours, and it benefits me to see you use your time well, or in contrast, to help you combat the social structures that force you to spend your time in ways that put you at a disadvantage. Why didn't I have to pay with food stamps and cash? Why didn't I have to count every coupon? Me waiting can be an investment in your situation to try to understand it and potentially build radical empathy for how people have to deal with time in very different ways. People sometimes have extraordinarily long commute times from their home to where they work, 2 jobs sometimes. Sharma talks about the slow food movement as a really interesting example as well, where you have these people who are deliberately trying to slow down this rapid pace of life, and gathering around very deliberately prepared plates of food. And what you have often, and so she went and did some observations of slow food movements, often typically with affluent white people, and in the background are all these workers rushing, often people of color working a second job, racing around to clean plates and make sure everything is in place. So her question is, who gets to slow down? How is time distributed unevenly? And how can we begin to imagine our wait times as investment in that disparity, to begin to understand people's situations differently? So thinking of time as collective rather than individual, as an investment in our social fabric. So there are benefits of waiting in some ways where we can, benefit from understanding waiting. We can benefit from the investment that we can put into certain things. However, there are times when waiting needs to be combated and fought, where waiting can be a tool of the powerful to maintain the status quo by forcing people to invest their time in ways that inhibit their ability to transform their social situation. It's hard not to think about Puerto Rico, for example, and the very long time that it's taken for electricity to be restored to the island, or thinking about Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and how slowly recovery efforts were rolled out as a way of perpetuating social inequality. Wait times can be that. And another tactic that I've been very interested in as well is thinking about how wait times can reveal our own hopes for the future and what might come on the other side of waiting. So in the moments of waiting, really analyzing what you hope comes on the other side. And part of this, I look at buffering icons as this won't turn into anything. It's not actually loading. It's just going to spin right there. I'm really interested in the buffering icon as this piece of software that reveals some of our hopes for what might come on the other side of buffering. And I advocate that we're actually half in love with the buffering icon because it's this moment of such great anticipation. Think about Facebook refreshing a feed or a dating app that you might be on, and you refresh and this buffering icon comes up. You're like, that is the moment of promise. What might come on the other side of that is somebody finally tweeting, Jason, that was the most amazing talk I've ever heard in my whole life. That's what I wanted to hear, So thinking about just using that moment of pause as an analytic is really useful, fascinating. And even for my own life, looking at, as I refresh Facebook, I'm constantly asking myself now, what is the future that I hope comes on the other side of this buffering icon? And it's really quite interesting because it rarely happens. You never quite find that thing on the other side. And it's really useful to understand that and to say, well, maybe Facebook is actually not the place for those hopes to materialize. So these desires can kind of teach us about our present situation, what we hope for the future, and thinking about how to build bridges toward those futures. And having these moments of pause be really useful moments of reflection. And some people actually advocate that we need to build in these systems for the digital age. That the digital age is predicated on instantaneous connection, and we're losing waiting, and we're losing a lot of the value that comes along with waiting. So we need to build in moments of waiting instead. So a really famous example here in New York City, Marina Abramovich's Goldberg Variations, which was put on here at the Park Avenue Armory 2015-2016 with Igor Levit, was you entered the Armory, you were given a key to a locker, you had to put all your stuff. Did anybody go to this, by the way?
In London.
Oh, in London. Okay, great. We should talk about this. It'd be interesting to hear your experience. So you have to put all your stuff in the locker, no watches, no mobile phones, and you are given a set of noise-canceling headphones. And you go and sit in these deck chairs that surround the piano. A gong rings, and you put on your headphones, and you have to wait in silence for 30 minutes. Nothing happens for 30 minutes. Kind of building on John Cage's 433, sort of this notion that silence is meaningful. Silence is content, which is something that echoes throughout the book. So for Abramovich, she said, you can't come off the streets of New York City into the Armory and hear Igor Levit play these Goldberg Variations and understand it. You need this moment of pause. You need the 30-minute wait time to understand how this piece is meaningful. And so a lot of people have been advocating that we need to build in wait times for us to really experience things in a way that we're losing. But also building in wait times for our own expectations. Facebook, for example, a couple of years ago launched a security scan of your profile, and you could hit it and it would tell you ways that you can make your profile more secure. And nobody was changing their security settings after doing this, and Facebook was wondering why. Why aren't people, changing their settings? They figured out that the code was so efficient that it spit back recommendations so quickly that people didn't believe it. They're like, that can't be thorough. So I'm not going to change my settings. So what the designers did would go in, they added a line of code that delayed the results for people. So it did the scan, pause, give people the information. And people were like, oh, that was thorough. And they went in and started changing their security settings because we anticipate a certain level of thoroughness that's associated with duration. And that duration wasn't there because the code was so efficient. So people are imagining ways that we need to build in these wait times to meet expectation, but also capture some of the things that we are losing. There's an app you can download right now where you can take pictures with it, but you don't get those pictures for 3 days. And you can't actually see what you're taking a picture of. It's trying to recapture some of that nostalgia of taking your film into the photo lab to get developed and you get them 3 days later. What was that experience like? And what's the surprise of opening up that envelope with your pictures in it and being like, oh, we're losing some of that with our contemporary mobile photo culture. So people are imagining ways that we might need to introduce wait times within our digital life. But I think if we can build in some tactics for waiting, tactics that recognize that our time is deeply intertwined with others and our wait times are ways of investing into that, we can become advocates for the value of waiting, that waiting becomes this interesting moment of analysis for us to understand social structures, power, even our own relationships, our most intimate relationships, and how we wait in those relationships. That we can become students of waiting and use these times to understand why perhaps we're so busy, why we feel compelled to fill our schedules to the point where we really can't breathe, and around the ideas of productivity and efficiency that waiting seems to contrast. If we embrace waiting, we may be able to begin unpacking that and combating some of those expectations around how our time is used. So ultimately unpacking waiting's power and its promise, but also its danger as well, and some of the ways that we can learn from it. So thank you very much.
Jason, that was the best talk I've ever heard.
Thank you. And I didn't need social media for that.